Rejected Omega sign to Alpha King Deaf Mother at the mating ceremony. What he did left everyone in shock. The Alpha King rejected her in front of everyone, called her worthless, and walked away without a second glance. But 3 months later at the grand mating ceremony, she stood up in a room full of predators and did the one thing no wolf had dared to do in 5 years. She walked past the guards, ignored the gasps, climbed the steps to the queen's throne, and began moving her hands in a language the deaf queen thought no one else in the kingdom knew. The moment Queen Leora's eyes filled with tears and she signed back, "You understand me?" the Alpha King's world exploded, and there was no going back from what happened next. Hey, beautiful souls, thank you so much for watching this far. Your time, your presence, it truly means more than words can say. If this story has touched your heart even a little, please take a second to subscribe and join our growing family of dreamers and believers. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I love seeing how these stories reach hearts all over the world. You being here makes this journey so special. Now let's begin. It was the evening of the grand mating ceremony, the kind of night where rank ruled everything and compassion was considered weakness. The air shimmered with dominance, gold banners draped across marble pillars, the scent of aged wine and ambition thick in every breath, and chandeliers reflecting the lives of wolves who had never known rejection. The ballroom of the Shadowfang Palace stretched 3 stories high, its vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of legendary alpha victories, each brushstroke a reminder that power was the only currency that mattered here. Yet amid the glittering gowns and arrogant displays of power stood a soft-spoken Omega named Siren Hale, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. She wore a plain servant's uniform, charcoal gray with silver stitching, that marked her as invisible, a ghost meant to serve but never be seen. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her hazel eyes stayed carefully lowered, avoiding the gaze of anyone who might remember her face and the humiliation it represented. She had been attending not as a guest, but as a ghost, invisible among the alphas and lunas who never looked twice at someone deemed unworthy. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 months ago, she should have been the one standing at the center of this ceremony, dressed in ceremonial robes, accepting the bond the moon goddess herself had forged. But that night had ended differently. That night had ended with 5 words that shattered her world. I reject you as mate. But tonight, a single gesture, a silent act of empathy, would change everything and leave even the most ruthless alpha questioning what true strength really means. If you believe in empathy, courage, and the power of second chances, then please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Because stories like this one remind us that even in a world ruled by dominance, the quietest soul can still command the room without uttering a single word. Siren had always lived quietly. Life had not given her the luxury of arrogance or entitlement. She grew up on the outskirts of the Shadowfang territory, in a small cottage that leaked when it rained and creaked in the winter wind. The Omega Quarter, they called it. A polite name for the place where the pack sent those they'd rather forget. Her father, Marcus Hale, had been a kind man, a carpenter with gentle hands and a soft voice. But kindness didn't stop rogue claws. He died defending the eastern border when Siren was 10 years old, and the pack gave her mother a folded flag and a pension that barely covered bread. Her mother, Elena, worked herself to exhaustion, cleaning alpha homes, mending clothes, doing whatever it took to keep Serene and her younger sister fed. Siren learned early that complaining was a luxury they couldn't afford. You kept your head down, you worked hard, you survived. But it was her sister, sweet, gentle Mira, born mute, who taught Siren the most important lesson of all, that love doesn't need a voice. Mira had come into the world silent, her first cry never emerging. The pack healers said her vocal cords simply hadn't formed properly, a quirk of genetics, nothing more. But in a world where wolves communicated through howls, growls, and verbal commands, silence was seen as a defect. Children avoided Mira at school. Adults spoke over her as if she weren't there. And Siren watched her bright, beautiful sister fade a little more each day, her eyes growing distant, her smiles becoming rare. So Seren made a promise. She was 12 when she found a battered sign language book at a traveling merchant's stall. She spent her saved coins on it, money she'd been saving for new shoes, and stayed up late every night by candlelight, practicing the hand shapes until her fingers ached. It took months. Her mother thought she was wasting time, but Seren persisted. And the first time she signed "I love you" to Mira, and her sister's face lit up with understanding, Seren knew she'd found something more valuable than any spoken word. For years, she practiced sign language in secret, learning every motion, every expression, so that Mira would never feel alone in a world that had no patience for silence. That skill, born of devotion, patience, and late-night practice by candlelight, had always been her refuge. A silent world where words could never wound, and connection needed no rank. She never imagined it would one day become the bridge between disgrace and redemption. She never imagined it would be the very thing that made an Alpha King fall silent in awe. Tonight, she moved through the ballroom like a shadow, balancing trays of crystal glasses filled with blood-red wine. The ceremony hall was breathtaking, vaulted ceilings painted with constellations, floors polished to mirror shine, and everywhere, wolves dressed in their finest, displaying their power like weapons. Alphas wore dark suits with pack insignias embroidered in gold thread. Lunas draped themselves in silk and jewels. Even the betas carried themselves with a confidence Serene had never been permitted to feel. The musicians played from a raised platform, violins and cellos weaving a melody that was both beautiful and melancholic, a song about eternal bonds and fated mates. Seren's chest tightened. And there, at the center of it all, sat Alpha King Kale Draven. He was every bit the ruler they whispered about, broad-shouldered and tall, with dark hair that fell just past his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His presence was a gravitational force that bent everyone toward him, a mixture of raw power and cold control. He wore black ceremonial robes trimmed with silver, and a crown of twisted silver branches rested on his head, a symbol of the ancient covenant between wolves and the moon. His expression was unreadable, his jaw set, his gaze scanning the room with the detached efficiency of someone who saw people as chess pieces. He never looked at her. Why would he? To him, she was nothing. 3 months ago, he had rejected her in front of the entire pack. The memory still burned like a fresh wound. She had felt the mate bond snap into place the moment their eyes met during the selection ceremony, a golden thread pulling her toward him with impossible intensity. Her wolf had surged forward, recognizing him, calling to him. But when she approached, trembling and hopeful, wearing her mother's best dress and carrying flowers picked from the meadow, he had looked at her the way one might look at a stain on expensive fabric. Cold, dismissive, final. I, Kale Draven, Alpha King of the Shadowfang Pack, reject you, Seren Hale, as my mate. The words had shattered her. The bond had snapped, leaving a hollow ache in her chest that never fully faded. But she survived. Omegas always did. Now she carried wine to wolves who didn't see her and cleared plates from tables where no one knew her name. She had learned to be invisible. But tonight, invisibility would become her greatest strength. Because across the room, seated beside the Alpha King on a throne carved from ancient oak, sat a woman whose loneliness Seren recognized all too well. Queen Leora Draven, the Alpha King's mother, deaf, dignified, and utterly, heartbreakingly alone. Chapter 2. The Court of Wolves. The grand mating ceremony was more than a celebration. It was a display of power, hierarchy, and control. It happened twice a year during the full moon of spring and autumn, when the pack bonds needed reaffirming and the dominant structure required public validation. The ceremony had roots stretching back centuries, to the time when wolf packs were scattered tribes fighting for survival, and unity meant the difference between life and death. Now it was theater. Alphas stood taller, chests puffed, displaying their mates and their influence. Betas positioned themselves carefully, aligning with powerful families, making connections that would serve them for years to come. and Omegas like Seren served in silence, reminders of what happened when you were born without rank. The Shadowfang Pack was the largest in the Northern Territories, a kingdom of wolves spanning 3 cities and countless smaller settlements. They controlled trade routes, held treaties with human governments, and commanded respect, or fear, from every pack within 1,000 miles. And Kael Draven ruled it all with an iron fist wrapped in velvet diplomacy. He was fair, they said. Just. He listened to counsel, considered options, made decisions based on logic rather than rage. But mercy was not in his vocabulary, and tradition was law. He had taken the throne at 23 when his father fell in battle against a rogue uprising, and in the 7 years since, he had transformed the Shadowfang Pack into an empire. But empires were built on foundations, and those foundations were rank. Alphas led, betas served, omegas existed in the margins. It was the natural order, the way things had always been. To question it was to question the moon goddess herself. Seren refilled a glass for a Luna draped in emerald silk, her neck glittering with diamonds that probably cost more than Seren's childhood home. The woman didn't even glance at her. To the highborn wolves, servants weren't people. They were furniture that occasionally moved. "Did you hear?" Someone whispered at the next table, a beta woman with perfectly styled blonde hair. The king rejected his true mate. "An omega," another voice hissed, dripping with disdain. A male beta with a sharp suit and sharper eyes. Can you imagine? The moon goddess must have been testing him. "He passed, clearly," the blonde woman replied, sipping her wine. "No alpha of his standing would ever accept such a weakling. It would undermine everything he's built." "I heard she cried," another voice chimed in, cruel amusement coloring the words. "Right there in front of everyone. Pathetic." Serene's jaw tightened, but she kept her face blank, her movements mechanical. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. The truth was, she hadn't cried, not in public. She had stood there, frozen as the bond shredded inside her chest as the entire pack watched her humiliation with either pity or satisfaction. She had walked out of that hall with her head high and her hands steady. It was only later, alone in her cottage with Mira's arms around her, that she had finally broken. At the front of the hall, the master of ceremonies, a silver-haired beta named Thorn with a voice like velvet and steel, raised his arms theatrically. "Honored pack members, it is time for the bonding ritual. All mated pairs, please rise." The hall erupted in movement. Chairs scraped against marble. Couples stood, hands intertwined, basking in the public acknowledgement of their bonds. It was beautiful in a way. Wolves who had found their other halves, who had chosen or been chosen, now standing together under the eyes of the pack and the blessing of the moon. But for Seren, it was salt in a wound that hadn't healed. She turned away, reaching for an empty tray, and collided directly with someone's shoulder. Wine splashed across the front of her plain uniform, cold and wet, staining the gray fabric dark. "Oh, how clumsy," came a syrupy voice, dripping with false sympathy. Seren looked up into the cold blue eyes of Lyanna Greythorn, daughter of the pack's second alpha. She was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, sharp, polished, dangerous. Her gown was ice blue silk that matched her eyes, and a diamond collar sparkled at her throat. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate updo, and her smile was all teeth. "I'm so sorry, my lady," Seren said quickly, bowing her head, keeping her voice neutral and soft. "You should be more careful," Lyanna said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. She tilted her head, her smile widening. "Though I suppose we can't expect much from omegas, can we? Especially rejected ones." Laughter rippled around them like poison spreading through water. Faces turned toward the commotion, eyes glittering with amusement or pity, both equally humiliating. "Tell me, Seren," Lyanna continued, her voice a knife wrapped in silk. "Does it hurt, knowing the king looked at you and saw nothing?" Seren's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to speak, wanted to defend herself. But she had learned long ago that fighting back only made it worse. Omegas didn't have pride. "Move along, little wolf," Lyanna purred, waving her hand dismissively, "before you embarrass yourself further." Seren turned and walked away, her heart pounding, her throat tight with suppressed emotion. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in months. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. She slipped into the servants' corridor behind the dais, leaning against the cool stone wall to steady her breathing. The corridor was narrow and dim, lit only by a few oil lamps, a hidden passage that allowed servants to move unseen through the palace. This was her life now. Humiliation, invisibility, endurance. She pressed her palms against the stone, focusing on the cold, grounding herself. She could hear the ceremony continuing on the other side of the velvet curtain, Thorne's booming voice, the laughter of the crowd, the swell of music. And then, cutting through it all, she heard something that made her pause. A soft, confused sigh. It was quiet, almost inaudible beneath the noise of the ceremony. But Seren's ears, trained by years of listening for Mira's silent struggles, caught it. She peeked through a small gap in the curtain. Queen Leora sat perfectly still on her throne, her posture regal, her gown a masterpiece of midnight blue and silver thread. But her eyes were lost. The master of ceremonies was speaking, gesturing grandly, and everyone in the hall was responding, standing, sitting, laughing on cue. But the queen had no idea what was happening. She smiled politely, her hands folded in her lap, but Seren could see it. The slight tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze flickered uncertainly from face to face, trying to read the room, trying to guess when to respond. No one helped her. They all looked away, pretending not to notice, as if acknowledging her struggle would be an insult to her dignity. And in that moment, Seren saw Mira, her little sister, sitting alone at school assemblies, smiling and nodding while everyone else laughed at jokes she couldn't hear. Seren's hands trembled, not from fear this time, but from recognition. She knew that loneliness, and she couldn't look away. Chapter 3. The Queen Who Couldn't Hear. Queen Leora Draven had not always been deaf. Serene had heard the story in whispers, the way all tragic tales were told in the pack, passed from servant to servant, from elder to youth, growing more dramatic with each retelling. But the core of it remained true. 20 years ago, Leora had been a formidable Luna, fierce and beloved. She had stood beside her mate, King Aldrich Draven, as they built the Shadowfang pack into a power that rivaled ancient dynasties. She was known for her strategic mind, her compassion for the vulnerable, and her unwavering protection of pack children. It was that last quality that had cost her. During a rogue attack on the northern border, a group of children had been caught outside the protection barriers, playing in the woods when they should have been safe at home. The rogues, wolves who had rejected pack life and turned feral, descended like a plague. Leora had been visiting the border settlement that day. When she heard the children's screams, she didn't hesitate. She shifted into her wolf form and threw herself into the fight, positioning her body between the rogues and the children. She held them off long enough for the pack warriors to arrive, but not before taking a vicious blow to the head from a rogue's clawed strike. The children survived, all 7 of them. Leora survived too. But when she woke 3 days later in the healing ward, the world had gone silent. The healers said the damage to her skull had affected the delicate bones of her inner ear. There was no cure, no magic that could restore what had been destroyed. The pack respected her. They honored her sacrifice. But respect, Seren had learned, was not the same as connection. And tonight, watching the queen sit in graceful isolation, Seren felt that truth more sharply than ever. The master of ceremonies raised his glass, his voice booming across the hall. To the strength of our pack and the bonds that unite us, may the moon goddess bless our unions and guide our future. The hall erupted in cheers, hundreds of wolves raising their glasses high, voices blending into a roar of unity and celebration. Queen Leora, a half-second too late, raised her glass as well. She had been watching the crowd, reading their movements, mimicking their joy. But Seren saw the flicker of uncertainty in her expression, the slight delay that marked her as separate. She was alone in a room full of her own people. Kale stood beside his mother, his attention on the crowd, accepting congratulations and clasping hands with visiting alphas from allied packs. He was in his element, commanding, confident, every inch the king. But he didn't notice his mother's struggle. Or perhaps he had stopped noticing years ago. Serene's chest ached. She thought of Mira sitting at the dinner table while their mother recounted her day. Mira would smile and nod, pretending to follow, even though she couldn't hear a word. She would laugh when others laughed, applaud when others applauded, always a half-beat behind, always guessing. Seren had hated that, hated watching her sister fade into the background of her own life, becoming a spectator rather than a participant. So she had learned to sign. Slowly at first, fumbling through books borrowed from the town library, practicing in front of a cracked mirror in their tiny cottage. Then obsessively, determined to build a bridge between Mira's silence and the world that had forgotten her. It had taken 2 years before she was fluent. 2 years of late nights and aching fingers and moments of frustration when the shapes wouldn't come right. But the first time she had a full conversation with Mira, about nothing important, just their day, their dreams, their favorite foods, and saw her sister's face light up with the joy of being truly heard, Seren knew it had been worth every moment. And now, watching Queen Leora, Seren felt that same pull, the same desperate, aching need to reach across the silence and say, "You are not alone." But who was she to approach a queen? She was nobody, a rejected Omega, a servant who had already been publicly humiliated. If she stepped forward, she could be punished, removed, humiliated again. And yet, the master of ceremonies gestured broadly, his voice carrying across the hall. "Now, as tradition dictates, we invite the royal family to lead us in the moon's blessing." The hall fell silent in anticipation, hundreds of eyes turning toward the dais. Kyle turned to his mother, offering his arm with practiced grace. But Queen Leora hadn't heard the announcement. She sat still, unaware, her gaze drifting toward the chandelier above, lost in her own thoughts. A few wolves shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Whispers started at the edges of the crowd. Kyle's jaw tightened, a flash of frustration crossing his features before he controlled it. He leaned down, gently touching his mother's shoulder. She startled slightly, pulled from wherever her mind had wandered, then looked up at him with a gracious smile. She rose smoothly, taking his offered arm as if she had meant to wait, as if the pause had been intentional. But Seren saw the flash of embarrassment in her eyes, the quiet resignation. The knowledge that she had missed something, that she was once again out of step with the world around her. She had missed her cue. Again. The crowd pretended not to notice. Polite, respectful, distant. They turned away, allowing her the dignity of pretending everything was fine, and something inside Seren cracked. She thought of Mira, sitting alone at her 6th birthday party, surrounded by children who didn't know how to talk to her. She thought of the way the other children had sung happy birthday, while Mira sat in silence, trying to smile, trying to pretend she wasn't being left out of her own celebration. She thought of the way Mira's face had crumpled later that night, when it was just the two of them, and she had signed, "Why doesn't anyone want to talk to me?" She thought of the promise she had made that night, kneeling beside her sister's bed, holding her small hands in her own. "I will never let you be invisible. I will never let you be alone, I promise." Serene set down her tray on a small side table, her hands trembling. Her heart was a drumbeat in her ears, so loud she was certain everyone could hear it. This was foolish, dangerous. She could lose everything, her job, her place in the pack, maybe even her home. But what did she have to lose that hadn't already been taken? Her mate had rejected her. The pack had humiliated her. She was already at the bottom. And at the bottom, there was a strange kind of freedom. She stepped out from behind the pillar. The ballroom stretched before her like an ocean, vast and glittering and full of predators. At the far end, on the dais, Queen Leora stood beside her son, a picture of grace and loneliness. Seren took a breath, and then another. And then, with trembling legs and a heart full of reckless compassion, she began to walk toward the queen. Heads turned. Whispers started like wildfire. A servant approaching the royal dais uninvited was unthinkable. But Seren didn't stop, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let someone suffer alone, even if it costs you everything. Chapter 4. The gesture that stopped time. Every step felt like walking through water. The ballroom stretched endlessly before her, polished marble reflecting the candlelight like a frozen lake. Serene's heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the whispers that followed her like a wake. Is that the rejected Omega? What is she doing? Someone stop her. The crowd parted instinctively, wolves stepping aside as she passed, their expressions ranging from shock to confusion to barely concealed disgust. A few betas exchanged glances, uncertain whether to intervene. An older alpha stood, his hand moving toward her, but his mate pulled him back, shaking her head. "Let her dig her own grave," the jester said. Seren kept her eyes lowered, her posture submissive, non-threatening. She wasn't attacking, she wasn't challenging, she was just walking. But walking toward the royal dais uninvited was itself a challenge. The musicians faltered, their melody dying mid-note. The master of ceremonies turned, his eyes widening in alarm. A guard stepped forward, his hand rising to stop her. He was tall and broad, a beta warrior named Garrett who had always been kind to the servants. "Miss, you can't—" But Seren kept walking, kept her gaze down, kept her hands visible and empty. Garrett hesitated. She wasn't being aggressive, she wasn't armed. And something in her posture, the quiet determination, the desperate courage, made him pause. She slipped past him. Kale's head snapped toward the commotion, his dark eyes locked onto her, sharp and dangerous, his entire body tensing like a wolf about to strike. For a moment, Seren thought he might order her removal. His jaw tightened, his hand clenching at his side, power radiating from him in waves that made her wolf whimper and want to submit. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She reached the base of the dais, her legs shaking so badly she worried they might give out. The 3 marble steps leading up to the thrones looked like a mountain. The entire hall had gone deathly silent. Even the fire in the great hearth seemed to hold its breath. Seren dropped into the lowest bow she knew, forehead nearly touching the ground, arms outstretched in a gesture of absolute respect and submission. It was the bow reserved for royalty, for moments of life and death, for pleas that could not be ignored. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, but in the silence it carried like a bell. "Your Majesty, may I approach?" She didn't look up, didn't dare. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. Seren could feel hundreds of eyes on her back, could sense the weight of judgment, contempt, and confusion pressing down on her like a physical force. Her wolf was screaming at her to run, to submit, to get away from the Alpha King's presence before he made her regret this moment for the rest of her life. But she stayed. Then a soft rustle of fabric. "Rise, child." Serene's head snapped up. Queen Leora was looking directly at her, curiosity flickering in her elegant features. She stood tall and regal in her midnight blue gown, silver thread catching the candlelight, her expression unreadable but not unkind. She hadn't heard Seren's words, but she had seen the bow, the respect, the plea in her posture. And she nodded permission. Seren stood on trembling legs and climbed the 3 steps to the dais. Each step felt like a violation of natural law. Servants didn't stand where royalty stood. Omegas didn't approach without being summoned. But Queen Leora was watching her with something that looked almost like hope. Seren could feel Kale's eyes burning into her. could sense his wolf rising to the surface, ready to protect his mother from any threat. His hand had moved to his side, where a ceremonial blade hung from his belt. But all she saw was the queen. Up close, Leora was even more beautiful. Silver streaked through her dark hair like moonlight on water, her eyes a pale gold that seemed to see straight through pretense. There was kindness in her face, but also a deep, abiding loneliness that made Seren's heart clench. She looked like Mira, not in appearance, but in that particular isolation that came from being left out of the world's conversation. Seren's hands shook as she lifted them, and then, slowly, carefully, she began to sign. "Your Majesty," her hands said, forming the words with gentle precision. "May I help you follow the ceremony?" For a heartbeat, nothing. The queen stared at Seren's hands, her expression frozen. And then her eyes went wide. Her lips parted in shock. Her hand flew to her chest, fingers splaying over her heart. And tears, bright, unguarded tears, filled her eyes. She lifted her own hands, fingers trembling. Do you understand me?" The question was signed with such desperate hope, such naked vulnerability, that Seren felt her own eyes sting. "Yes," Seren signed back, smiling softly through her own threatening tears. "I understand." A sound escaped the queen, half laugh, half sob. She pressed her fingers to her lips, overwhelmed, and then signed again, faster now, almost frantic. "No one has spoken to me like this in years. No one. They all look away. They pretend. But you—" She couldn't finish. Her hands dropped and she pulled Seren into an embrace. The entire hall erupted, not in anger, in awe. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through grass. Someone dropped a glass, the crystal shattering on the marble floor, the sound impossibly loud in the shocked silence. Wolves leaned forward in their seats, craning to see, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The rejected Omega, the one they had mocked, dismissed, ignored, was speaking to the queen in a language none of them knew. And the queen, the dignified, untouchable queen, was crying. Kale stood frozen beside his throne, his hand still on his blade, his expression a war of confusion, shock, and something that looked almost like pain. His mother was in the arms of the woman he had rejected, and she was crying tears of joy. Lyanna Greythorn, watching from her table, looked like she'd been slapped. Her perfect composure cracked, jealousy and fury flashing across her features before she controlled it. The master of ceremonies stood with his mouth open, completely at a loss for what to do. Queen Leora finally pulled back from the embrace, holding Seren at arm's length, her hands gripping Seren's shoulders. She turned to the crowd, her voice clear and strong, a voice she rarely used in public because she couldn't hear it to modulate it. "This woman," she said, her words slightly accented from years of not hearing her own speech but powerful nonetheless, "is the first person in 5 years to speak to me in my own language." Her tears spilled over, running down her cheeks. She saw me struggling, and when everyone else looked away, when it was easier to pretend, to be polite, to ignore, she stepped forward. She turned back to Seren and signed as she spoke aloud, her voice breaking with emotion. "Stay beside me. Please." Seren's eyes widened. "Your Majesty, I am only a servant." "You are the first person to see me as something other than broken," the queen signed, her hands fierce and elegant. "You are the first to treat me as whole. Stay." Seren looked helplessly at Kale. The Alpha King stared back at her, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with emotions she couldn't name. Shock, confusion, shame, and beneath it all, something that looked like the beginning of understanding. Then slowly he nodded. And Seren Hale, the Omega no one wanted, took her place beside a queen. For the first time in her life, she was seen, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 5. Speaking in Silence. Word count: 1,152 words. The ceremony continued, but everything had changed. Seren stood beside Queen Leora's throne, her heart still racing, her hands no longer trembling. The initial shock had settled into something surreal, a dream she was afraid to wake from. The queen had gestured to a small cushioned stool beside her seat, and though Seren had hesitated, one look at Leora's determined expression made it clear. This was not a request. So she sat, an Omega, on the royal dais, beside the queen of the Shadowfang pack. The court couldn't stop staring. Whispers filled the hall like the buzz of 1,000 bees, some scandalized, some curious, some grudgingly impressed. But no one dared voice their objections, not when the queen herself had invited this, not when Kale had nodded his permission. The master of ceremonies, Thorn, cleared his throat awkwardly, his silver hair slightly disheveled from running his hand through it in distress. This had never happened before. There was no protocol for this. But he was a professional, and the ceremony had to continue. We now honor the moon goddess with the traditional blessing," he announced, his voice only slightly shaky. "May all mated wolves join in unity and renew their vows before the pack." Seren's hands moved gracefully, translating his words into sign language. Her movements were fluid and precise, each gesture deliberate and clear. Queen Leora watched, her eyes bright, nodding along. For the first time that evening, perhaps for the first time in years, she wasn't guessing. She wasn't lost. She was present, engaged, connected to the ceremony in a way she hadn't been since losing her hearing. The mated pairs in the hall stood, joining hands, reciting the ancient words of the moon's blessing. "By moon and pack, by blood and bone, we stand together, never alone. Through storm and peace, through joy and strife, I pledge to you my heart, my life." Seren signed each line, her hands painting the words in the air. Leora's lips moved silently along with them, her expression one of profound gratitude and joy. When Thorn made a flowery joke about young love, "May your passion be as eternal as the moon, and your arguments as brief as shooting stars," Serene translated it with a small smile, adding the playful tone through her facial expressions. The queen's face lit up. She laughed, a clear, crystalline sound that hadn't been heard in the hall for years, unguarded and genuine. The entire room froze. Because Queen Leora never laughed in public. She was always composed, controlled, regal, a statue of dignity who smiled politely but never showed unrestrained emotion. But now, here she was, laughing at a joke she finally understood, her hand covering her mouth as her shoulders shook with genuine joy. It was the most human she had seemed in a decade. Beside her, Kale stared at his mother as if seeing a ghost. When was the last time he had heard her laugh like that? Not the polite chuckle she gave at state dinners, not the diplomatic smile she wore like armor, but this, real, unfiltered happiness. He couldn't remember, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. How long had she been silently suffering? How many moments had she missed? How many jokes had passed over her head? How many conversations had she been excluded from while he sat beside her, oblivious? His gaze shifted to Seren, heavy and searching. She wasn't looking at him. All her focus was on his mother, her hands moving in that beautiful, flowing language, building a bridge of words where none had existed before. She had done in 10 minutes what he had failed to do in 5 years. She had made his mother feel seen. The ceremony moved through its phases. The bonding ritual, the moon's blessing, the presentation of newly mated pairs who would stand before the pack and declare their bonds publicly. And through it all, Seren translated, her signs clear and steady, never faltering. At one point, a young couple stood to announce their bond, a nervous alpha male from one of the border settlements, and his Omega mate, a sweet girl with flowers woven into her hair. The male was stumbling over his words, his face red with embarrassment, and his mate kept giggling, ducking her head against his shoulder. I, Torin of the Silver Creek settlement, claim you, Alara, as my— wait, did I say that right?" He looked at Thorn desperately. "Is it claim or choose?" The hall rippled with gentle laughter. "Choose," Thorn prompted kindly. Right. I choose you, Alara, as my mate and— oh, goddess, I'm making a mess of this." Alara stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. "You're doing fine," she whispered loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, which made him turn even redder. Seren translated their vows, adding the nervous energy and sweetness into her expressions, her eyes soft with amusement. She exaggerated Torin's flustered expression and Alara's fond exasperation, making it a story rather than just words. Queen Leora's smile was radiant. She signed to Seren. "They remind me of my own mating ceremony. I was so nervous I tripped on my gown walking up the steps." Seren's eyes widened. Truly, Leora signed, her eyes twinkling with the memory. "Kyle's father caught me before I fell. He said it was the moment he knew I'd keep him on his toes forever. And I did. For 23 beautiful years." There was a sadness beneath the humor. King Aldrich had died 7 years ago in battle against a rogue uprising, the same event that had brought Kale to the throne too young and too suddenly. But there was also warmth in Leora's signs, memory, love that hadn't faded even in death. Seren signed carefully, her movements gentle. "He sounds like he was a wonderful man." "He was," Leora replied, her hands soft with affection and grief. "And he would have liked you very much. He always said the bravest wolves were the ones who chose kindness even when cruelty would have been easier." Seren's throat tightened with emotion. She bowed her head in gratitude, unable to speak, unable to sign, simply feeling. For years, she had been invisible, a shadow, a mistake the moon goddess had made in pairing her with an alpha king. But here, now, beside this queen, she felt seen in a way she never had before. Not because of her rank, not because of her beauty or strength or lineage, but because she had chosen kindness when no one else had, because she had seen someone suffering and decided that her own fear mattered less than their loneliness. Beside them, Kale sat rigid, his hands gripping the arms of his throne so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He was watching his mother, truly watching her, and seeing what he had been too blind, too busy, too absorbed in ruling to notice. She had been lonely. For years, she had sat beside him at ceremonies, councils, banquets, smiling and nodding and pretending to be part of a world she could no longer fully access. She had learned to read lips and body language, to guess at conversations, to mimic responses. And he had let it happen. He was a king, a protector, an alpha who prided himself on taking care of his pack, on ensuring every wolf under his rule was safe and provided for. But he hadn't taken care of her. And it had taken a rejected Omega, someone he had deemed unworthy without a second thought, to show him what he had missed. Shame burned in his chest, hot and unfamiliar. But beneath the shame was something else. Awe. Because Seren Hale, the woman he had cast aside like garbage, was braver than any wolf in this room. She had risked everything to offer his mother a single moment of connection. And in doing so, she had shattered every assumption he'd ever made about strength. Chapter 6. The Queen's Champion. Word count, 147 words. As the final blessing concluded, the Master of Ceremonies bowed low, clearly relieved to have made it through the most unconventional ceremony in Shadowfang history. The grand mating ceremony is complete. May the moon goddess guide us all, and may our bonds remain unbreakable through all the ages to come. The hall erupted in applause, wolves rising from their seats, conversations bubbling up like champagne uncorked. But all eyes kept flickering back to the dais, where an Omega sat beside a queen, where something impossible had just happened. The rigid hierarchy they had all lived under their entire lives had just been challenged, and the sky hadn't fallen. Queen Leora rose gracefully, and the room fell silent once more, all attention snapping back to her. She commanded respect even in her silence, perhaps especially in her silence. She turned to Seren, who immediately stood and bowed deeply, preparing to excuse herself, to fade back into the shadows where Omegas belonged. But the queen reached out, gently lifting Seren's chin with her fingers so their eyes met. "What is your name?" she signed, her movements elegant and precise. "Seren Hail, your majesty," Seren said aloud, her voice soft but clear, steady despite the hundreds of eyes watching. Recognition flickered across Leora's face, followed quickly by understanding, then anger. She knew that name. She had heard it 3 months ago, whispered in the corridors by servants who thought she couldn't hear gossip. She had seen it written in reports, had caught fragments of conversations. Her son had rejected his true mate, an Omega named Seren Hail. She had asked Kale about it, had signed her concerns about rejecting a mate bond, something that went against the moon goddess's will. But he had waved her worries away, saying it was pack business, tradition, necessity. He couldn't have an Omega queen. The pack would never accept it. And she had accepted his explanation because she trusted her son, because she believed he knew best. But now, looking into Seren's gentle eyes, seeing the quiet strength and profound kindness in this young woman, Leora understood exactly what kind of person her son had thrown away. The queen turned to her son, her hands moving sharply, her signs almost violent in their precision. "This is her? This is the woman you rejected." Kyle's jaw tightened. The entire hall was watching, and while most didn't understand sign language, they understood the queen's body language well enough. The rigid set of her shoulders, the sharp movements of her hands, the disappointment in her eyes. She was angry. "Mother," he began, his voice low, meant only for her. Leora's hands cut through the air like blades. "Don't, not now. We will discuss this later." The promise of that conversation hung in the air like a threat. She turned back to Seren, her expression softening immediately, and then she did something that made the entire court gasp in collective shock. She took Seren's hands in both of hers, a queen, holding an Omega's hands as equals, and addressed the room, her voice clear and strong, the voice she rarely used in public because she couldn't hear it to modulate it properly. But tonight, she didn't care. "This woman," Queen Leora said, her words measured and powerful, carrying across the silent hall, "showed me more respect in one moment than I have received in years. You could have heard a pin drop. She saw me struggling, and when everyone else looked away, when it was easier to pretend, to be polite, to ignore, she stepped forward." Leora's voice wavered with emotion, but she held firm, her back straight, her chin high. "She risked humiliation and punishment to offer me kindness. She gave me something I thought I had lost forever, the ability to truly participate in my own life, to understand the world around me without guessing, without being half a step behind everyone else." Tears streamed down the queen's face, but she was smiling, her expression radiant. "For that, I owe her a debt I can never repay." She turned to Seren and signed as she spoke aloud, so everyone could witness both languages, so there would be no doubt about her meaning. "You will sit beside me for every ceremony, every council, every gathering from this day forward. You are under my personal protection. Anyone who harms you harms me." Serene's eyes went wide, her heart hammering in her chest. "Your Majesty, I cannot possibly, I am not worthy of such—" "You can. You will," Leora signed firmly, brooking no argument. Then, softer, her hands trembling slightly, "Please, don't make me face that silence alone again. Don't make me go back to being invisible in my own kingdom." Seren's vision blurred with tears. How could she say no to that? How could she refuse when the queen was asking not as a ruler, but as someone who understood loneliness, who knew what it meant to be forgotten? She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The queen pulled her into an embrace, a queen embracing an Omega in front of the entire pack, breaking every rule of protocol and propriety, and the room erupted. Some wolves applauded, genuinely moved by the display, by the raw emotion and unexpected connection. These were the older wolves, the ones who remembered when Leora had been able to hear, who had seen her withdraw over the years. Others whispered furiously, scandalized by the breach in hierarchy, worried about what this meant for the established order. If an Omega could sit beside the Queen, what came next? Chaos? The dissolution of rank entirely? And a few, like Lyanna Greythorn, looked on with barely concealed fury, their faces twisted with jealousy and rage. Lyanna's knuckles were white where she gripped her wine glass, and if looks could kill, Seren would have dropped dead on the spot. But none of that mattered to Seren, because on the dais, in the arms of a queen, she finally felt like she belonged somewhere. When the embrace ended, Queen Leora turned to her son and signed, her movements deliberate and unmistakable. "We will speak. Tonight. Privately. There are things we need to discuss about your choices." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Even a king answered to his mother sometimes. Kyle bowed his head, his jaw tight. "Yes, mother." Leora offered her arm to Seren, the gesture formal and respectful. "Walk with me. I want to hear about your sister, about how you learned our language. I want to know you." And so, as the grand mating ceremony dissolved into mingling and music, as the court watched in stunned silence, Seren Hale walked arm-in-arm with the queen of the Shadowfang pack, her head held high for the first time in months. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer worthless. She was seen, valued, protected. Behind them, Kale remained on the dais, his hands gripping the throne, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite organize. He had built his life on certainty, on tradition, on the belief that strength meant dominance, that weakness meant Omega, that the natural order existed for a reason, and questioning it was foolishness. But in one night, one gesture, one act of breathtaking courage, a woman he had thrown away had proven him catastrophically wrong, and now he would have to face the truth he had been avoiding. He had rejected his mate, and she was extraordinary. Chapter 7. When the Alpha Broke. The Queen's private chambers were warm and softly lit, a stark contrast to the cold grandeur of the ceremony hall. Tapestries depicting moon phases hung on stone walls, their threads silver and blue in the candlelight. A fire crackled gently in the hearth, filling the room with the scent of burning cedar. Comfortable chairs surrounded a low table, and shelves lined with books and small treasures gave the space a lived-in, personal feel. This was Leora's sanctuary, the one place in the palace that was entirely hers. Seren stood near the door, hands clasped in front of her, still unable to believe she was here. Queens didn't invite Omegas into their private chambers. This didn't happen. Queen Leora sat in a high-backed chair upholstered in deep blue velvet, her posture regal even in private, even in her own space. She had removed her ceremonial crown, setting it aside on a table, and somehow she looked both more human and more formidable without it. Kale stood before her like a child summoned to account for his mistakes, despite being a head taller than his mother and the most powerful alpha in 3 territories. Some things transcended rank. A mother's disappointment was one of them. Leora's hands moved sharply, her signs precise and controlled, but Seren could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Explain. Explain to me why you rejected your mate." Kale's jaw tightened. He glanced at Seren, clearly uncomfortable having this conversation in front of her, but his mother's expression made it clear he had no choice. "Mother, the rejection was necessary," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "The pack expects strength in their Luna. An Omega cannot be queen. You know this. The Alphas would never accept it. The other packs would see it as a weakness. I would be seen as..." Leora's hand sliced through the air, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I don't care what the pack expects. I don't care what tradition dictates. I care about what is right. Tradition exists for a reason." Tradition, Leora signed sharply, is just another word for fear of change. Kale's fists clenched at his sides, frustration and shame warring in his expression. An Omega cannot lead beside an Alpha King. The pack would never accept it. I would be seen as weak, and weakness in a leader gets wolves killed. You taught me that. Leora stood abruptly, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made even Kyle step back. She spoke aloud, her voice trembling with controlled fury, each word carefully enunciated. "Is that what you think of me, then? Am I weak because I cannot hear? Am I less capable, less worthy of respect, because I need help to navigate a world not built for me?" "No," Kyle said immediately, his voice rough with emotion. "Mother, you are the strongest person I know. You have more courage and grace than anyone in this pack." "Then explain to me," she signed, her movements fierce and demanding, "how this woman, this Omega you deemed unworthy, showed more courage tonight than every Alpha in that hall combined." Kale had no answer. His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in years, the Alpha King was speechless. Leora turned to Seren, her expression softening immediately, the anger melting into curiosity and warmth. "Tell me, child, why did you learn to sign?" Seren's voice was barely a whisper, but in the quiet of the chamber, it carried. "My sister, Your Majesty, Mira. She was born mute. I learned that she would never feel alone in a world that didn't understand her, so she would always have someone who could hear her even though she couldn't speak." "And do you love her?" Leora asked gently. "More than anything," Seren said fiercely, surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "She is the kindest, brightest soul I've ever known. Her silence doesn't make her less. It just makes her different. Would you reject her because others see her as weak?" "Never," Serene said, her eyes flashing with protective anger at the very thought. "Anyone who thinks she's weak doesn't know her at all. She has more strength in her little finger than most alphas have in their entire bodies." Leora turned back to her son, her expression pointed. "Then you understand nothing of true strength." She moved to stand before Kale, reaching up despite their height difference to cup his face with both hands, forcing him to meet her eyes, to truly look at her. "Kale," she said aloud, her voice breaking with emotion. "I have been alone in my silence for so long. 5 years. 5 years since I lost my hearing, and in that time I have smiled and nodded and pretended everything was fine. I let everyone believe I was managing, that I didn't need help." Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she made no move to wipe them away. "But I was drowning. Every ceremony, every council meeting, every dinner where conversations happened around me, and I could only guess at what was being said. I was drowning in loneliness, and no one noticed." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "No one except her." She gestured to Seren without looking away from her son. "A woman you rejected. A woman your pack has humiliated and dismissed. A woman who had every reason to ignore me, to look away like everyone else. And she still chose kindness. She still chose to see me, to help me, to risk everything for a stranger who couldn't give her anything in return." Kale's composure was cracking. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, his throat working against emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "I was wrong," he said hoarsely. The words dragged from somewhere deep inside him. "Mother, I was wrong." "Wrong about what?" Leora signed, unrelenting. "About everything." He turned to Seren, and for the first time he truly looked at her, not as an Omega, not as a rejected mate, not as someone beneath him in rank and power, but as a person, as someone worthy of respect, as someone extraordinary. "I was taught that strength meant dominance," he said, his voice raw and honest. "That weakness was something to be culled, not compassion, something to be valued. I built my entire life on that belief. I built this pack on it." He took a shaky breath, his hands trembling slightly. "And then you stepped onto that dais tonight, risking everything, your safety, your position, your dignity, to help someone who couldn't help you in return. You didn't do it for power. You didn't do it for recognition or reward. You did it because it was right. Because you saw someone suffering and decided that their pain mattered more than your fear." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. You are braver than I have ever been, stronger than I could ever hope to be. Serene's eyes widened, tears spilling over, because she had never expected to hear those words. Never thought she would see the great Alpha King humbled, vulnerable, honest. Kale dropped to one knee before her, an Alpha King, kneeling before an Omega he had rejected. The gesture was unthinkable. It violated every rule, every tradition, every understanding of how the world worked, but he did it anyway. I cannot undo the rejection, he said, his voice breaking. I cannot take back the pain I caused you, the humiliation, the months you've spent being invisible and mocked. But I can say this. I was wrong. About you. About what strength means. About everything I thought I knew. He bowed his head. I am sorry, Seren Hale. You deserved better than what I gave you. And if I spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the lesson you taught me tonight, I will still fall short. Silence filled the room, heavy and profound. Then Seren knelt as well, meeting him at eye level, refusing to let him debase himself alone. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, for seeing me, finally. And in that moment, two broken souls, one who had rejected, one who had been rejected, began, slowly, carefully, to heal. Chapter 8. The Kingdom Shifts. 3 weeks had passed since the grand mating ceremony, and the Shadowfang pack was still reeling from the aftershocks. The palace corridors buzzed with constant speculation. Servants whispered in corners. Nobles debated in drawing rooms. And everyone had an opinion about what had happened that night, about the Omega who had approached the Queen, about the reforms that were surely coming, about what it all meant for the future of the pack. Change was in the air, and it made the traditional wolves nervous. Alpha King Kale Draven had called an emergency council, and the Great Hall was packed beyond capacity. Alphas, betas, and for the first time in the pack's 300-year history, Omegas sat together in the audience, summoned to witness whatever proclamation their king was about to make. The tension was palpable, electric, dangerous. Serene stood in her now familiar position behind Queen Leora's chair on the dais, her role as the Queen's personal interpreter and attendant now official and recognized throughout the pack. She wore a dress in the Queen's colors, midnight blue with silver embroidery at the collar and cuffs, a visible mark of her position and the Queen's favor. The whispers about her had not stopped. If anything, they had intensified. Some wolves admired her courage and spoke of her kindness in hushed, reverent tones. These were mostly Omegas and lower-ranking betas who had themselves felt invisible, who saw in Seren's story a glimmer of hope. Others resented her meteoric rise from servant to the Queen's right hand, grumbling about favoritism and the breakdown of proper order. These were primarily traditional alphas who feared what her elevation might mean for their own power. And a vocal few actively hated her, seeing her as a threat to everything they held dear. Lyanna Greythorn led this faction, her jealousy having curdled into open hostility. But none could deny that Queen Leora was transformed. The Queen attended every council meeting now, participated actively in discussions, offered insights that had been trapped inside her for years. She laughed openly. She engaged with visiting dignitaries through Seren's interpretation. She had come alive in a way the pack hadn't seen since before she lost her hearing, and it was all because of Seren. Kale rose from his throne, and the hall fell into immediate, breathless silence. He wore his formal robes of office, black with silver wolf emblems embroidered across the shoulders, and the crown of twisted silver branches sat heavy on his head. He looked every inch the king. But there was something different in his bearing now. A humility that hadn't been there before, a thoughtfulness in his eyes that suggested he was seeing his pack, truly seeing them, perhaps for the first time. Members of the Shadowfang pack, he began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hall, resonant with alpha command. I have called you here today to announce changes that are long overdue, changes that I should have implemented years ago. The crowd shifted uneasily, wolves exchanging nervous glances. For generations, for centuries, we have operated under a hierarchy that values rank above all else. Alphas lead, betas serve and support, omegas endure. His gaze swept across the room, landing briefly on the omegas seated in the back rows, many of whom looked shocked to even be present at a council meeting. But endurance is not the same as thriving, and a pack that does not care for all its members, that does not value every wolf regardless of their designation, is not a pack. It's a dictatorship built on fear and tradition for tradition's sake alone. Murmurs rippled through the hall, like wind through tall grass, some approving, many anxious. Kyle raised a hand for silence, and it came immediately. Effective immediately, the following reforms will be implemented. First, all omegas will have access to the same educational and training opportunities as alphas and betas. No wolf will be barred from learning, from developing their skills, from pursuing their potential based solely on their designation at birth. Shocked gasps echoed through the space. An elderly alpha stood halfway, his face reddening, but his mate pulled him back down with a warning look. Second, Kale continued, his voice firm and unyielding. Sign language will be taught in all pack schools and made available to every pack member who wishes to learn. Communication is a right, not a privilege. And those who cannot hear or speak deserve to be part of our community fully, not isolated by our collective ignorance. He glanced at his mother, and Leora smiled, her eyes shining with pride and unshed tears. Third, I am establishing a council position specifically for Omega representation. Our laws and decisions affect everyone. Everyone deserves a voice in their governance. The first Omega Council member will be elected by the Omega community within the month. Now the murmurs grew louder, more agitated. Several alphas stood, their expressions ranging from confused to outraged. An older alpha named Rothgar, his gray beard bristling with indignation, spoke out. "This is madness! Your Majesty, you would overturn centuries of tradition, centuries of natural order for what? For sentiment? For progress," Kale cut him off, his tone like iron wrapped in silk. "For justice. For the kind of pack my father would have wanted me to build. For the kind of pack the moon goddess intended when she made us all, alpha, beta, and omega alike, part of the same whole." He stepped forward to the edge of the dais, his presence commanding even without the throne behind him. "My father taught me that a true leader protects the strong and the weak equally. That strength without compassion is tyranny. I forgot that lesson. I let tradition and fear guide me instead of wisdom and justice." His voice softened slightly, becoming more personal. "These changes are not up for debate. They are law. Anyone who cannot abide by them is free to leave the Shadowfang pack and seek a home elsewhere. But know this, any pack that does not evolve, that does not grow, that clings to the past out of fear of the future, is a pack that will eventually die." The room fell into stunned silence. Then slowly, Queen Leora stood. All eyes turned to her. She signed, and Seren spoke her words aloud, her voice clear and strong. "My son has shown more wisdom in these past 3 weeks than in the previous 7 years of his reign. I support these reforms completely, and I expect every loyal member of this pack to do the same." The weight of the Queen's approval settled over the hall like a blanket. Slowly, hesitantly, wolves began to stand. First the omegas, then progressive betas, then some of the younger alphas who had always questioned the rigid hierarchy. They applauded. Not everyone. Rothgar and his supporters remained seated, their expressions sour. But enough. Enough to show that change was not just possible, but inevitable. Kyle's expression remained neutral, controlled, but Seren saw the flash of relief in his eyes. Later that evening, Seren sat with Queen Leora in the palace gardens, the stars bright overhead, the moon nearly full and glowing silver. "You did this," Leora signed, her movements gentle and affectionate. Seren shook her head firmly. "Your son did this. He chose to change. Because you showed him how. Leora insisted, reaching over to squeeze Seren's hand. Never underestimate the power of one act of kindness. It ripples outward in ways you cannot imagine. Seren looked up at the moon, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years, perhaps had never been. She thought of Mira, who would soon be able to attend the pack school with other children who could sign, who would finally have friends who could communicate with her easily. She thought of the Omegas who would no longer have to live in fear and silence, who would have opportunities her mother never had. And she thought of Kale, an alpha king who had chosen to break with centuries of tradition because one rejected Omega had shown him a better way. Change was never easy, but it was possible. The next day, Seren taught her first official sign language class in the palace's education wing. 30 wolves attended, betas, omegas, even a handful of young alphas whose parents had encouraged them to learn. And in the back row, trying his best and failing often but never giving up, practicing the hand shapes with endearing determination, sat Kale, learning to speak the language of the heart. Chapter 9. The Language of the Heart. 6 months after the grand mating ceremony, the palace gardens had become Seren's favorite refuge, a place of peace and reflection. She sat on a stone bench beneath a weeping willow tree, the evening air cool and sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and honeysuckle. In her lap was a leather-bound journal filled with sketches of sign language movements, detailed notes, and lesson plans. She was developing a standardized curriculum for the pack's schools, something that could be shared with other packs who had started reaching out, asking to learn from Shadowfang's example. The changes had been profound. The first Omega Council member, a brilliant former teacher named Iris Moonwhisper, had already proposed 3 laws that passed unanimously, including protection for Omegas against workplace discrimination and mandatory education for all pack children, regardless of designation. Sign language classes were full every session, with waiting lists stretching months long. And 3 neighboring packs had sent delegations to observe Shadowfang's reforms, considering implementing similar changes in their own territories. The world was shifting, slowly but undeniably. "You're still working," came a familiar voice, warm and slightly amused. Seren looked up to find Kale approaching along the garden path, dressed simply in dark trousers and a linen shirt, his usual formal armor and crown set aside. In the evening light, without the trappings of kingship, he looked younger, more approachable, more human. "So are you?" she replied with a small smile, gesturing to the documents tucked under his arm. He held up his hands and signed, slowly but clearly, the movements much more confident than they had been months ago. "May I join you?" Pride flickered in Seren's chest, warm and genuine. 6 months ago, he hadn't known a single sign. Now he practiced daily, determined to communicate with his mother and the growing deaf and mute population in his pack without always needing an interpreter. She nodded, and he sat beside her on the bench, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. They had never addressed the mate bond directly. It was still there, dormant but present, a golden thread neither had chosen to sever or actively pursue. The rejection had damaged it, but not destroyed it completely. It existed in a strange liminal space, waiting. They existed in a similarly strange in-between. Not quite strangers, not quite friends, not quite mates, but something uniquely their own. But they had become something more important than any of those labels. They had become people who saw each other clearly, without the fog of rank or prejudice. "I received word from the Eastern Pack Coalition," Cal said, setting his documents aside. 5 packs are implementing similar reforms. They want to send delegates to learn from our programs, to observe our schools, to meet with Iris and the Omega Council. Seren's eyes widened with delight. "Truly? 5 packs?" "Truly." He smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his usually serious features. "Your work is spreading beyond our borders, Seren. You're changing the world for Omegas across the territories." "Our work," she corrected gently but firmly. "You're the one with the power to make laws. I just showed you a different perspective." He shook his head, his expression turning serious, thoughtful. You were the spark, Seren. Everything else, the laws, the reforms, the changes, those are just me finally learning to tend the fire you started. Without that first moment of courage, none of this would exist. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the evening sounds. Crickets singing, the distant sound of laughter from the palace where the queen was hosting a dinner, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. I brought you something, Kale said quietly, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, its surface polished, smooth, and carved with delicate wolf designs, and handed it to her. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was a silver pin shaped like two hands forming the sign for voice, one of the most beautiful and meaningful signs in the language. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of a master silversmith. It's the new symbol for the Omega Council, Kale explained, his voice soft. Every council member will wear one, but I wanted you to have the first one, the original. Because without your voice, without you finding yours and helping my mother find hers, none of this would exist. Seren traced the delicate metalwork with trembling fingers, her throat tight with emotion. It's beautiful, Kale. Thank you. You were right, you know, he said quietly, turning to face her more fully. That night at the ceremony, true strength isn't about dominance or power or ruling through fear. It's about connection, about seeing people, really seeing them, and having the courage to help even when it costs you something. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I was a fool to reject you, not just because of the mate bond, though that was foolish enough, but because I rejected everything you represented. Kindness, empathy, courage that doesn't need to roar to be heard. I rejected the very qualities that make a true leader. Serene met his gaze, seeing the sincerity there, the growth he had undergone, the man he was becoming. You've learned, she said softly. You've changed. That's what matters, Kale. Not who you were, but who you're choosing to become. Will you ever forgive me? Truly? He asked, vulnerability clear in his voice. She considered the question, not rushing her answer, giving it the weight it deserved. I already have, she finally said, and meant it. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about choosing not to let the past define the future. It's about recognizing that people can grow, can change, can become better versions of themselves. She smiled gently. You're not the same Alpha who rejected me 6 months ago. And I'm not the same Omega who was rejected. We've both grown. And maybe that's exactly what the moon goddess intended all along. Kyle's shoulders relaxed, relief flooding his features like sunrise breaking through clouds. Thank you, he signed, and spoke simultaneously, the words carrying the weight of months of regret and hope. At that moment, Queen Leora appeared on the garden path, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. When she saw them sitting together, deep in conversation, she smiled warmly and signed to Seren, Don't let me interrupt. I just came to enjoy the evening air. You could never interrupt, Seren signed back with genuine affection. Please, join us. Leora settled onto a nearby bench, and the three of them sat beneath the stars, singing and speaking in a comfortable rhythm, the conversation flowing between spoken word and silent gesture seamlessly. They were an unusual family, a queen who couldn't hear, an Alpha learning to listen, and an Omega who had found her voice without ever raising it. But they were whole in their brokenness, complete in their differences. Later, when the queen retired for the evening and Seren prepared to return to her own quarters in the palace's guest wing, Kale walked her through the garden to the side entrance. Seren, he said, his voice tentative, careful. I don't know what the future holds, for us, for the bond, for any of it. But I want you to know, you changed my life. You changed everything. You made me want to be better, to be worthy of the pack I lead, to be the kind of king my father would be proud of. She reached out and squeezed his hand briefly, the touch warm and full of unspoken understanding. "You changed too," she said gently. "That's what matters. Not the bond, not what might have been, but who we are now and who we're becoming, and I'm proud to know you, Kyle, proud to call you my friend." Friend, not mate, not king, just friend. And somehow, that felt exactly right. As she walked back toward her quarters, Seren looked up at the moon, full and bright and beautiful, and signed toward the stars, her hands graceful in the moonlight. Even silence has a heartbeat. Even the voiceless can speak. Even the broken can be made whole. Because in a world that worshipped the roar, Seren Hale had taught them all to listen to the whisper. She had shown them that true strength wasn't about dominance or power, but about compassion and courage and the willingness to see others, truly see them, in all their vulnerability and beauty. And in doing so, she hadn't just changed a kingdom. She had reminded them what it means to be truly alive, truly connected, truly human beneath the wolf. The reforms would continue, the changes would spread, and somewhere, in another pack, another Omega would hear Seren's story and find the courage to speak up, to step forward, to believe that they too had value. Because that's how revolutions happen, not with war cries and violence, but with quiet acts of kindness that ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, touching shores you never imagined reaching. Seren smiled up at the moon, her heart full of peace and purpose. She had been rejected, broken, dismissed as worthless. But she had risen, and in rising, she had lifted countless others with her. Thank you for joining us on Seren's journey from rejection to redemption, from silence to strength. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about courage, compassion, and the power of second chances. In the comments below, tell us, have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever found your voice in an unexpected way? Your story matters, and we'd love to hear it. Remember, you don't have to roar to be heard. Sometimes the quietest voice changes everything. Until next time, may you find the courage to see others, and may you always know that you are seen. This is the story of Seren Hale, the Omega who spoke in silence. And her story is just beginning.